Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us as we make a virtual visit to Derek Jarman's garden at Prospect Cottage in Kent in England, accompanied by our speaker tonight, Jonny Bruce, who is its primary gardener. While studying for his degree in history of art at Cambridge, Jonny came to Italy and worked at the Boboli and La Pietra gardens in Florence. And he explained to me at that time he was feeling slightly uncertain about his future in the art world. And it was Nick Dakin-Elliott, the curator of the latter garden, that suggested that he might be long-term in gardening. And he decided then to get a horticultural apprenticeship at Aberglasley Gardens in Wales. A year later, he was awarded the Christopher Lloyd Scholarship and lived for 2 years at Great Dixter, what a dream, in East Sussex, and working alongside head gardener Fergus Garrett, before leaving for the Netherlands, where he spent over 4 years at the organic perennial nursery De Hessenhof. In 2021, he returned to the UK and now works freelance as a gardener, writer, and planting consultant. He is currently setting up an organic herbaceous perennial nursery in the Cotswolds to fill the gap in the market in England that Brexit has left for good plant material. So I'm going to hand over to Jonny because he's going to take us all around the garden. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And over to you, if you'd like to share your screen now.
Thank you, Angela. Okay, let's see. Quickly.
I can, yes.
That should, is that all clear now?
Yes, it's loading. Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, anyway, thanks so much for having me. I'm a huge fan of the Mediterranean Garden Society and have myself actually been a beneficiary of a travel grant from the Mediterranean Garden Society to go to Tunisia, after which I wrote a small article for the Quarterly Journal. And yeah, I've written articles about quite a few Mediterranean gardens, including by the design of James Basson, and about the nurseryman Olivier Philippi and his wife Clara down in Montpellier. And yeah, I just think such a great organization. So it's a real pleasure to speak with you this evening. But yeah, this garden is a garden that was created by the artist, activist, filmmaker, general polymath Derek Jarman, and it was created in a remarkably short amount of time. I think most people would consider gardens taking, they say things about taking 20 years, 25 years, but Derek actually came to this garden in 1986, and he would actually die only 8 years later. And I think it's really remarkable that in such a short space of time, he was able to do something genuinely innovative and new in the garden space, in a world that is pretty conservative and traditional. So what we're looking at here is the front of the garden. One of the distinguishing features of this garden is there are no boundaries. There's no fences or walls. Derek used to say that the boundaries of my garden are the horizon, and you can see off into the distance Dungeness, the power station. Dungeness is on the tip of Kent, on the southeast corner of the United Kingdom, where the channel bends round the coast. It slows down, depositing large amounts of shingle on that spit. It's a sort of unique shingle formation that sticks out into the channel, and there's a really unique diversity of life that has developed here on what's often referred to as Britain's only desert. I mean, I've been there for many years now. I first came here in about 2012, and it certainly rains a hell of a lot. So whether it can really be defined as a desert, I'm not sure. Certainly we get more rain than most of you in places like Menorca, I heard someone saying earlier. But the cottage was created by this man. This is Charles Richardson. He built the cottage in 1904, and Dungeness really existed as a very isolated community. You often hear references to Dungeness as being the fifth quarter of the globe. There's a real sense when you're there that you are on the edge of the world almost, and that's certainly how Derek described it. So this community of fishermen that used to fish off the point of Dungeness, and they just built these shacks very informally without much, tenancy agreements or anything like that. They were, close-knit community that has existed there for hundreds of years, but they were really cut off, and it was only with the creation of the power station that this community became more connected to the outside world. Here is a picture that predates the power station, and a notable aspect of this is that there is no road. Anyone who's visited Prospect Cottage will realize that the way to access, there's a road that runs right long in front of the cottage. But here, this photo from about the 1940s, you can see that it's really just a cluster of shacks looking out towards the sea. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is the sea here, and circled in orange is Prospect Cottage. Importantly, you can see that it's set forward from its neighbours. There's three houses in a row here, all a bit further back, and the reason for that is they're a little bit older than Prospect Cottage by about 30 years. And you can see here, this is a more recent Google Images screen grab showing firstly the road, but also how far away the sea is compared to that previous image. So you can see the shoreline is really not that far in front of the cottage, whereas 80 years later we've got a good couple of almost over 100 meters, 200 meters of shingle that's built up. And the interesting thing about this was that actually when Charles Richardson first built this cottage in 1904, he writes in his diary about how the winter storms came and the water entered the cottage, and they thought they were going to nearly lose the building. So it's just a way of illustrating what a shifting landscape this is. The other side of the point has been constantly eroded by the sea, and the point in front of the cottage is extending. And this affects the way we garden as well, because obviously when Derek was gardening almost, over 30, well, 40 years, almost 40 years ago now, he writes a lot about the damage of salt spray, and, it's a very inhospitable location to create a garden. And you could say that as the sea is retreating from the garden, somehow it's becoming a bit more sheltered and somehow slightly easier to garden here. I mean, we certainly still have salt winds, particularly when it blows from the north. A lot of the shrubs in the garden get blackened by these aggressive salt winds. And yeah, there's no bones about it. It's still a difficult place to garden. It's a very unusual landscape. As we said, it's unique in the UK. It's incredibly flat. There's this huge sky. There are these old fishing boats that still litter the nest, these sort of remnants of the fishing industry that was. Now, sadly, there's very few boats still going out, just two boats that still go out and fish commercially from the nets. And as a result, largely to do with the common fisheries policy. Sadly, this community is very against the European Union as a result of that. But it really adds to the sort of atmosphere of the nest, these remnants of the fishing community that still exist there. But then in the horizon, on the back of the cottage, you have this astonishing superstructure of Dungeness power station, which is one of the first nuclear power stations in the country. And that road that I mentioned, the primary purpose of that road was to provide access for diggers and trucks to come and dig up shingle from the lee side of the nest in order to transport that shingle back again to reinforce the area around the power station to stop it from falling into the sea. So there was something sort of very uncertain about its presence, and I think it adds an incredible sense of scale, but a lot of people find it quite unnerving having this nuclear power station so present on the horizon. And Derek Jarman writes a lot about it in the book as being a place of potential danger, explosions coming at night, and I think obviously it's a lot safer now, and it has actually now been decommissioned. But Derek Jarman also was obsessed with the story of the Wizard of Oz. And when you see this power station lit up at night, it really looks like the Emerald City, and you can see how this place, this landscape, captured his imagination. So this is the view from the back of the garden. We'll look more about the structure of the garden a bit later, but if you can remember from that first image, the front garden is actually quite formal with some quite, literal geometry, sort of squares and circles. And at the back, the intention was always to have a sort of more looser style of garden. It's important to say that he actually came to Dungeness not with a real intention to create a garden. He was on a recce with the actress Tilda Swinton, of whom he discovered and gave her some of her first film roles, and his partner Keith Collins, looking for filming locations for his film The Last of England that was made that same year in 1986. And it was supposedly Tilda Swinton who hard-armed Derek into buying Prospect Cottage when they went past it and it had a little for sale sign in the window. But yeah, here's the contrast to the front where you can see this really distinct geometry with these large flints that Derek used to go and collect from the low tide. Especially after a strong storm, you find these astonishing big stones which Derek described as dragon's teeth. And then this looking out towards the cliffs of, slightly hazy this picture, but on a clearer day you can see the cliffs of Dover. So that's the sort of the opposite view, away from the power station towards the sea. The gorse almost always in flower. There's a saying that kissing is out of season when the gorse is out of flower, and it flowers almost continually at Dungeness. So just a little bit about my relationship to this garden. Yes, as Angela said, I did an art history degree, and I had a fascination with horticulture. Yeah, that time with Nick Bacon Elliott in Italy was really profound, and on returning from Italy, it was actually whilst I was in Italy that my mother gave me a copy of Modern Nature, Derek Jarman's incredible garden diary memoir, which is a must read for anyone, I think, interested in this garden. And it really caught my imagination in such a powerful way. And I decided to make Prospect Cottage the subject of my undergraduate thesis. This is going all the way back to 2011. And I then got to know Keith Collins, who was then the owner of Prospect Cottage, through the research for my dissertation. And after getting the Christopher Lloyd Scholarship to work at Dixter, which is only about 40 minutes down the road, I reached out to Keith and I said, oh, maybe I could come and help you on the weekends. And I turned up, and on the first day of working with Keith in the garden, with this plant, which is Atriplex halamus, saltbush, which I'm sure many of you grow. In my mind, it was a well-adapted plant for this situation. Silver leaves, can deal with high salinity. I thought that would be good for the coast. I picked it up from Beth Chatto's nursery, so good, reliable nursery. But what I hadn't considered was the fact that it'd been fine. It was a well-suited plant, but it had been growing in a polytunnel, or at least in a sort of soft nursery situation, for a couple of years in a big pot of compost. And when I took it down, Keith very sweetly, we made this bed together and planted it. sort of something ceremonial about that. But I think I came back in about 6 weeks and it was completely dead, which wasn't maybe the most, it didn't have the best omen for my relationship to this garden. But it really allowed me to understand that probably what I should have done when we planted this was cut 2/3 of the plant down, because it's really the constant wind that is the biggest struggle in this garden. And yeah, there's plants that are grown too lushly with too much fertilizer really struggle with the harsh conditions at Dungeness. And we don't have someone there regularly to water. So a bit like there's a lot of the same principles that designers like James Basson and nurseries like Olivier Philippe's are proposing, that you should really commit to a planting window in the autumn and try and use higher mineral substrates, so less compost, more sand and stones, and try and grow those plants harder so that they're more able to deal with the intense heat and wind and drought in the summer. But I just wanted to focus just quickly on a man who, without whom there just would be no garden to look after, and that's Keith Collins. Keith was Derek's great love. They never had a sexual relationship, but they were intensely devoted to each other. And Derek left Keith his entire estate when he died in 1994 from AIDS. They met at a film festival in Newcastle, which was Keith's hometown. He was studying computer technology, and he came down to London to see Derek and was sort of entered into this art world, this creative scene in London. And then when Derek died, Prospect Cottage had always been more Derek's domain, and Keith looked after the house in London. But then after Derek died, Keith moved down to Prospect and really took on the stewardship of this garden, looking after it with real care. And he actually became a fisherman for 8 years on the Ness, and in a way was, through that process, was absorbed into the sort of the bosom of the community at Dungeness in a way that Derek, although everyone that I have met has always said only affectionate things about Derek, I think there was a real love that grew for Keith. And that connection to the local community at Dungeness is something that I'm very keen to preserve and continue. And Keith very sweetly introduced me to lots of local people, some of whom's family have gone back, they go back hundreds of years on Dungeness. So yeah, Derek made the garden, and we should always think of it as Derek's garden for that reason. But Keith tended it and preserved it for 25 years. So his contribution should never be understated. Okay, but 2018 is an important year because that is the year that that Keith Collins died. He was diagnosed with a brain tumor in May and died in August of that year. And so we had a very short amount of time to create a sort of plan for the garden. I had moved to the Netherlands by this point. I was still in touch with Keith, but my relationship to Prospect was quite limited. But when he was on the hospital, he asked me whether I would look after the garden in his stead. And the garden sadly had really suffered. It had gone into a period of neglect where Keith, due to ill health and a lack of money, hadn't been able to really invest the resources into the garden. And so really what we did was about just getting it back to a structure, pulling out the weeds, weeding out all the grass, to reveal the beds with the dragon teeth flint that Derek had created. Also these large Mediterranean shrubs, things like Santolina and Cistus, that had just completely grown into one huge mass in the back of the garden. You can see we just cut everything back by about, 80%, 90%. as you all know, these shrubs, particularly the Santalinas, love, and Heliochrysums and these sorts of things, love being really hard pruned. And just re-establishing these rivers of shingle that run through the garden. So we have this negative space between the shrubs rather than this enormous mass of overgrown woody plants. When Derek first came to the garden, it was really the stones and the driftwood that were the beginnings of it. There was the he would go and, as I said, he went and picked up these large dragon teeth flints, but he also collected bits of driftwood and sort of flotsam and jetsam that he found on the nest to decorate it. And it was actually a dog rose that he found on Dungeness, which he transplanted into the garden. That was the sort of first moment of planting. And he used one of these driftwood stakes to mark its location. And so this relationship between the plants and these uprights, these driftwood stakes, has always been sort of integral from the beginning. And yes, he uses a lot of the sort of endemic plants of the nest and native wildflowers, but of course he also used plants that would grow there, and like the Santalinas and the Sisters, this Mediterranean palette of plants became increasingly important. His original vision actually was inspired by his time at Curry Mallet in Somerset, which was a sort of a manor house. I think there might be a picture of later, which was full of, roses and a real traditional English cottage garden. That was sort of his vision when he started to sort of fantasize about a garden at Prospect, but quickly realized that the salt winds and the intense heat wasn't going to facilitate it. So he adapted. And, now we think about right plant, right place, Beth Chatto, very much kind of typical ideas. But Derek wasn't a trained horticulturist. He came to this garden really with just his own sense of intuition, and started just working with the plants that would grow there. This picture shows some example of an experiment that never really worked. Derek did try a lot of things that failed, and one of these was these vegetable beds. So he got his friends Howard Suley and Peter Fillingham to build these raised beds, into which he filled them with peat-based compost and then planted lots of leafy vegetables, which obviously did not work. Not only was the conditions completely inappropriate for those types of plants, but he also was spending a lot of time in London. This was a very creative time of his life. He was making hundreds and hundreds of paintings. He made a load of films, which involved him going away for long periods of time. So, of course, he was in the garden a lot, but actually, and on top of that, obviously, he was in the hospital for prolonged periods as his body succumbed to various illnesses connected to his HIV. And so the vegetable plan never really worked. But what happened was then the beds were just left to rot. And in 2019, there was this astonishing fundraising campaign funded by the Art Fund in the wake of Keith's death to raise money to create an endowment for the garden. And it was pretty much the last thing to happen, or just at the beginning of COVID. We managed to raise £3.6 million, which is just a testament to how much this garden is in the public imagination and how relevant it is and how many people care about this place. Because I think there was almost 10,000 individual donations to the crowdfunder, obviously encouraged with sort of larger donations from trusts and things, but still a huge amount of money was raised, which isn't to keep the garden in perpetuity. Sadly, there was about 3 years of legal wranglings between the Art Fund, who raised the money, Creative Folkestone, who are the local arts charity who are managing the cottage, and the trust, which were in charge of Derek Jarman's estate. And it took 3 years before those funds were available. But as soon as they were, one of the first things we did was we rebuilt these beds. We bought we got new timbers in, reconstructed them, and then instead of the compost that Derek had, we replaced it with sand. So this is 40 centimeters of pure sand. I'm sure many of you are growing in very high mineral soils, and really it's just, there are people like Olivier, obviously, but also growers like Peter Korn up in Sweden, who I hope has maybe spoken to your group before, because these guys have really pioneered this growing in pure sand. It allows the plants to grow harder. They have to produce much more extensive and deeper root systems. These beds are never watered because the roots get down to find that, that's idea about sand always being, well, it can be so hot on the surface that you can't stand on it, but put your toes just a few centimeters down and there's always a cool, moist environment relatively near the surface. And that principle contains just enough moisture to sustain a lot of these plants, particularly plants that are adapted to Mediterranean environments. And the benefit is that this sand remains so hot that the seeds tend not to germinate. Certain plants, like Anthemis tinctoria and other plants, do seem to self-sow pretty successfully on top of the sand. But for the large majority of local weeds, they can't get a foothold. And because the plants grow more compact, that's a real benefit for us. With the wind, stops the plants getting blown around. So it makes them more resistant to pest and disease. So this has been a really successful project, converting these beds to sand beds, and we'll see more of that. Yeah, so here are some plant examples. Again, we're just leaning towards more of the Mediterranean species. This Artemisia canna came to me from Cassian Schmidt at the incredible Hessenhof garden in southern Germany, in Weinheim, which probably has as close to a Mediterranean climate as you can get in Germany. Really an amazing garden that everyone should try and visit. And yeah, Heliochrysums always do well. Salvia officinalis Nazareth, this particularly beautiful, almost white leaf form of common sage, which I was given by a man called Frank Fischer, whose nursery also in southern Germany, in Freiburg. Frank Salvias is a real, he has one of the largest collections of salvias in Europe, and if anyone has any salvia related questions, he has to be the most knowledgeable salvia expert I've ever met. And then on the right, you can see slightly messy photograph, but it's to show what we were doing. So one bed was used to plant up with medicinal and culinary herbs, partly inspired by all the herbals that Derek Jarman loved and wrote a lot about. He was obsessed with magic and alchemy. He saw himself as a white witch, and he also described Prospect Cottage as a pharmacopoeia. This idea that the plants within the garden could be used to make kind of potions and remedies was definitely one that was in his mind. So it seemed appropriate to plant the horseshoe bed in that way. But then the other large square, we weren't quite sure what to do with it. And it seemed a good opportunity to, we're taking the garden in some ways back and keeping it in the frame of how Derek had created it and how Keith maintained it. But we also always want to be trialing new things. So that large square bed has been turned into a trial bed for shrubby Phlomis. And recently plants have come from all over the place, but just this year I planted about 12 new ones, which I picked up from Olivier's nursery in Montpellier. So here were a few. You can see things like Phlomis viridis, Monocephala, Grandiflora, Leucofracta. These plants actually came to me from an amazing nursery in Hastings in the south of England called Zephyr plants. And what's great about those particular plants is that they were grown in sand. So Toby Shaw, who's the nurseryman doing a wonderful job there, is also growing a lot of plants in this like high mineral substrate, which makes it a lot easier to transplant into the sand beds. It's the same problem like with my Atroplex at the beginning of the talk. When you plant a nice juicy specimen that's been grown in a 2 litre pot in a load of compost from a, probably in a polytunnel, they always suffer that transplant shock. So if we can have plants that have been grown tough outside in deep pots with a higher mineral content, it makes it much easier to transplant them. And other plants that I just think have been really effective, like this Onopodimira canthum. What I love about this thistle, I mean, I love thistles just in general, but this one, the intense purple of its flowers then actually, as it opens, extends to the outside of the bracts. So by the end of its flowering, you have the entire head, this intense metallic purple rather than just the flower. They're a very ornamental plant. Okay, and then it's also a nice opportunity to grow bulbs, unusual plants, things what, as I said, we're always trying to introduce new varieties. I had a lovely opportunity when I was cleaning up cold frames along the side of the cottage that I found a whole cache of labels from when Derek was doing the garden. And it was really reassuring to find loads of plant labels of things that definitely didn't exist in the garden anymore, but plants that we were experimenting with, sort of things like certain types of eryngiums. And but I feel if Derek, you can't keep a garden in aspic, and you also always need to be, but this idea that you're looking after a historic garden with a certain heritage, you want to have this feeling that you're maintaining the garden in the similar spirit to the original creator. And Derek was, he loved going all over the southeast of England, visiting nurseries, picking up unusual things. And so every year we always try and introduce a few extra new things. And this fritillary should get a little bit higher than it does on Dungeness, but the winds seem to keep it short. In the garden, I have it flowering at about 50 centimeters high, whereas here it gets about 20 centimeters high, but still very pretty thing. Sand beds have been wonderful, but they've also, probably our biggest problem with the sand beds is that they create a lovely playpen for this particular fellow. This is our resident fox. There are quite a few. One time we actually had a whole litter of foxes under the cottage, which is really tricky, but they love playing in the sand beds, and they dig up all my labels and the plants themselves, which is something that I kind of tolerate. But now that the flomas are getting established, it's actually really distressing when I come down having been away for a few weeks and find half the flomas have been dug out of the bed and lying desiccated on the ground. Happened a couple of times. And then here we have a view from inside the cottage. And, this relationship with the inside to the outside is very important. And now, since Creative Folkestone has taken management of the cottage, it is now open to the public. So there are certain days of the year that you can arrange a tour of the inside, and to understand that connection between the cottage and the garden is really fundamental. But also, one of the things that we did, this image shows a collection of pots, which are really in reference to the gardens that Derek had as he was living in London and throughout his life. I think there are some more pictures of the pots, but he lived this peripatetic existence in London, moving between artist studios and warehouses, and he never really had the time or the space, or he didn't own property in the right way to create a garden. And actually, if you watched it, there's a beautiful documentary. Oh, it's not a documentary, it's an interview with Jeremy Isaacs, who used to be the head of Channel 4 in the UK back in the 80s. He interviews Derek quite near the end of his life and talks to him about Prospect Cottage. And he says, well, the funny thing is I should have always been a gardener. there's this sense that actually, even though he had this incredibly successful career as an artist and a filmmaker, it was that process of making a garden that really was the natural culmination of his artistic endeavors. And I think the pictures are, yes, so this book here on the right, this is Beautiful Flowers and How to Grow Them. This was Derek's first book, and he actually says a lovely line in one of his memoirs where he says that plants grew up and entangled themselves through the pathways of my childhood. The sense that plants were always with him, like when he was at boarding school, from a really young age, he was pretty hopeless at sports. He was bottom of the class. I mean, he was pretty badly bullied, but the one place he excelled was in the school he was at, which was Canford. They actually had sort of allotment challenges where the boys were encouraged to look after a little plot of ground, and he actually won prizes for rows of Love in the Mist. And even as a very young boy, he had a real sensitivity to plants. There's a lovely moment where he was forced into combined cadet force, which is a sort of junior form of army training that was popular in British public schools. And when instructed to teach the younger boys field work, he took that, I think, in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way. He was discovered teaching all the boys the different names of the plants and the trees and the fields, rather than doing square bashing or whatever they should have been doing. But yes, this is the house, first, well, one of his homes in London, just to show the type of existence he had before he moved to Prospect Cottage, this place called Bankside. You know, these squatted warehouses that were very common in the old industrial East End of London, often overtaken by artist communities later on, completely unheated. And so in order to stay warm in the wintertime, Derek actually built a glass house inside the warehouse, which he effectively lived in. And in these places, he always had potted gardens. And so that's the pots of Prospect really. And he always did have a few pots of plants at Prospect, which had obviously gone away. And we really just wanted to restore that aspect of the garden. Here's the one of the homes that he grew up in as a child in Somerset. This is a place called Curry Mallet, the manor house at Curry Mallet. And you can sort of see this idea of how he wanted to create an English cottage garden with these formal rose borders, how that sort of had infiltrated from quite a young age. Yeah, this is an interesting thing with Derek, where he's very claimed by the radical left as a political activist, very anti-Thatcher, anti-conservative politics, but his background is actually one of, relative affluence, and he was very sort of upper middle class in a way. And it complicates him as an artist. He has a strong sense of sort of English traditionalism that feeds into both his art and his garden making. But I think it's actually these two, his sort of radical activism and his traditional attitudes, actually can be seen running parallel and don't contradict each other. But now, to just give a little bit more attention to the actual plants that grow at Prospect Cottage, particularly in this sort of moment of the year in June, where May, June, July, where Dungeness is normally quite a subtle, subdued landscape. I know I said the gorse is almost sort of that yellow of the gorse is pretty present, but the stones are the sort of soft browns and blues, a tiny bit of purple. But then for a few months of the year, there's just this explosion of color. And one of the iconic plants are these California poppies that Derek sowed into this geometric square at the front of the garden. Plants like Nephophia and Ruta graveolens, all plants that, obviously not native, but well adapted to the environment. The Nephophia has a double-edged meaning for Derek. If any of you who know Derek Jarman's films, he was very interested in reclaiming queer and gay characters from history and exploring them and celebrating them. And one of those was Edward II, the sort of, yeah, sadly unfortunate king who notoriously had many affairs with his male courtiers, and so much so that he was eventually executed, well, not assassinated, um, by having a red hot poker inserted into his nether region, which was very much something that Derek played on with this, having this plant in the garden. And actually, he got an artist friend to cast the Nephophia, the red hot poker, in bronze, which lies on a counter in the cottage. So there's a sort of, yeah, double meaning and a bit of, I mean, historical reference, but also a bit of playfulness in the garden here. Okay, on the left is Achillea crocata. This is a little diminutive Achillea from the Balkans. This is a plant that I introduced to the garden as part of just feeling free to experiment with new plants, those plants that Derek didn't necessarily have access to. But this is a lovely, slightly creeping, lovely sort of sulphur yellow flowers, and also nice that it only flowers at about sort of 10, 15 centimeters high. Also, always these slightly more diminutive plants are good at Dungeness to avoid the wind. And then on the right we have, you know, a plant that really establishes incredibly well on the shingle is common foxglove. We kind of associate this plant, Digitalis purpurea, with you know, with woodland edges, but actually it's really does incredibly well out in the exposed sunshine of the shingle. Teasels, echiums. This is a wonderful plant here on the left, Wolfania exfortii, can deal with really tough environment. It's got these nice leathery, shiny green leaves and then these delicate blue flowers. On the right, Angelica pachycarpa, which is a monocarpic umbel. Derek had really great relationships with different gardeners around the UK, but primarily Christopher Lloyd at Dixter. And this plant actually was a gift from Christopher. Here's a nice picture of Christopher with Beth Chatto, and they really discovered Prospect Cottage. They came down to look at the wildflowers, and then Christopher wrote an article about Prospect Cottage for Country Life, which was really the first time that the garden had been sort of entered into at least the horticultural kind of consciousness. And Beth was so moved by the garden and so impressed by the way Derek was using plants that they went on to have this prolonged correspondence about the garden. Here is the mosaic. Anyone who's been to Great Dixter, there's this rather whimsical mosaic of Christopher Lloyd's pet dachshunds, and the nose and the eyes of this dachshund actually were gifted to Christopher by Derek. And so there's this lovely sort of conversation between Dixter and Prospect Cottage where plants went one way and the stones went the other. Here's a copy of the letter that Derek wrote to Beth Chatto listing. It's a very beautiful letter where he just lists all the plants that are in flower a mile radius from his home, in response to a request from her. Yes, as she says, you can see this quote on the bottom about how affected she was by Derek and his use of plants. Some more iconic plants on the left. This is just red valerian, non-native. Actually, they use quite a lot of herbicide on Dungeness to control this plant as it has escaped out into the wild, not from Prospect. It's naturalized on the nest for a long time, but it is considered an invasive species. But it provides a real burst of color in June. And then Cranby on the left. This is one of the most iconic plants at Dungeness. It's the largest population of this plant anywhere in the UK. And the Sambucus on the right, this elder tree, and the only sort of tree that really exists at Prospect, that we prune into these almost like topiarized balls, not so much because we like the shape, but more to protect the tree from the whipping wind. And also in the UK, there's a belief that elder trees protect from magic. From evil magic, from witches, and that you should never cut if you have an elder tree growing near your house, you should never cut it down, as it's protecting you from the bad witches. Beautiful plants that, Euphorbia rigida, I think, should be a mainstay in almost every Mediterranean garden. It just has to be one of the most. It provides so much. Here on the left, in February, these sort of acid green flowers, and then on the right, the way those flower heads age into these sort of mottled red, and it's gently self-sowing in the shingle. Here's Cranby, really well established on the shingle in these amazing drifts. On a hot sunny day, it's almost overpowering, this honey smell of the flowers. It's a little bit too much to get into now, but this is the idea that these dragon's teeth flints were really a reference to Greek myth, ancient myth, and this idea that Derek deliberately imbued this garden with ideas of mythology and alchemy, and that we shouldn't be worried to find these references in the garden. We find them repeatedly in his paintings. This is a painting by John Nash, but here's a painting by Derek even before he moved to Prospect Cottage. So these symbols were already present in his artistic mind, these vertical uprights, these stones, and this flat landscape. And you can see how artistically the garden at Prospect Cottage makes total sense as a continuation of his artistic practice. And there's a danger that some people refer to Derek's gardening as almost like a pastime, away from his artistic practice rather than an integral part of it. And here we have those, you can see the similarities. And there's a sort of anthropomorphism of these. They're all about 6 foot high, these tall, these tall driftwood sculptures, which he described as battalions. This idea that the garden is not as, it's not as purely a restful retreat. I mean, there's an idea that Derek, contracted HIV, and he was facing very discriminatory legislation from Thatcher's government, but there's no sense that he was trying to escape those things by moving to Dungeness. He was engaging. The last 8 years of his life were probably the most politically active of his career, and also the most creative in terms of the amount of films and paintings he produced. So this garden should be seen in that context, and we'll talk later about that, as gardens not always been seen as retreats. But a lot of these unusual sculptures, which all came from the nest itself. Here again, just this link. One of the things that we do at the garden is we burn these gorse circles to control the gorse, planted by people actually to demarcate their boundaries, because there's a rule on Dungeness that you're not allowed to put up a fence or a wall. It's not an artistic decision not to have a fence or a boundary, even though that was obviously very appealing to Derek. But you could see also how, I just love this image of this sort of totem driftwood sculpture with the smoke rising in the late sun, and how it visually links to this film that he made called In the Shadow of the Sun, again before he even moved to Dungeness, which is very ritualistic, showing his interest in alchemy. So here's the process of burning the gorse and doing these slightly ritualistic circles. Here the garden in its midsummer glory. And it's always reassuring to see these new shoots. I think you should see the garden at Dungeness as, an act of hope. The idea that he made this garden in the shadow of this terrible illness, and this political atmosphere is very important, because actually you can see creating a garden also in such an inhospitable location as actually, and more than that, is like an act of defiance. And as Ian Hamilton Finley famously said, you know, some gardens are described as retreats when they're really attacks. If anyone hasn't heard of Ian Hamilton Finley, he was an amazing poet, gardener, architect who lived up in Scotland and created an astonishing garden called Little Sparta just outside Edinburgh. And there's a really interesting, I think, conversation, even though I don't think Derek or Ian were particularly aware of each other, or at least not their garden making. You know, there's a really nice conversation between these two places, particularly this idea that the garden space can be one of ideas of philosophy and myth, not just an aesthetic place of retreat. Yeah, we know about this. It's very much, it's such an important sense of context as to what Derek was really fighting for, and I think this energy and passion really feeds into the garden as well. Yeah, these pictures that that Howard Suley took of Derek at the end of his life, I think, are so moving. I think we don't have time to go through this whole poem, but please feel free to look back at this. Again, just really showing how Derek kind of viewed the landscape of Dungeness and how he sort of integrated through his poetry his fury really about the situation with the AIDS crisis. It's a very moving poem, but almost as moving as again, here on the left is a photo by Howard of Derek really suffering right at the end of his life. And I think that image just really captures the intense love that existed between Derek and Keith. And, you know, we said that Derek's life in London had been a very peripatetic one, and that in a way, as he said, like, he should have always been a gardener. And there's a sense in 1986 when he found Prospect Cottage, it provided him with a geographical centering that gave him, in a way, a sense of security and the ability to create some of his best artistic work. But also the sort of other side to that centering was this emotional centering that the relationship with Keith provided him, because they met the same year. So 1986, very important, because he met Keith, he started creating the garden, and he was diagnosed with HIV all in that year. So yeah, the garden has definitely gone through a tough time when I think there was like big questions about its relevance and its survival. But now in the last few years, when we've done so much work in the garden, and twice a year I invite groups of volunteers and students to come and help me in the garden, and it's so gratifying to feel, you know, a lot of different types of people. These weekends are open to everyone of all ages, skill levels. We have quite a strict limit on numbers of people, but it's just really a way to engage or allow people who have an interest in Derek and his legacy to come and experience working in the garden. And it's great for me, we get a lot of the work done, but it's so fun hearing the conversations and the ideas that sort of bubble up through these evenings. We invite everyone down to have a bottle of wine in the cottage after work on a Saturday night and share stories. And, you know, I think there's a big question about, you know, when a gardener dies, does the garden die with them? Like, should we be maintaining these historic properties? But I don't see my role as one of a necromancer to try and resurrect Derek in some way. It's really just to preserve his legacy, because I think there's something valuable in it. And the number of people that come to the garden and have come really almost as out of a type of pilgrimage, because they've been so inspired by Derek or they're so fascinated by this garden, I think is testament to how relevant this garden still is. And when we do these student weekends, it's really when I feel that the garden is at its most vibrant. And even though I'm sure Derek and probably Keith as well would have had big questions, would raise their eyebrows at some of the things that the cottage is now being used for, I really think they would have approved of this aspect of what we're doing. It's definitely one of the most rewarding things that I am able to do with the garden. And so here are just some pictures of what the garden what it looks like in recent years, where really just with that extra bit of care, bringing new plants into the garden, allowing it to breathe a bit more. We're really not doing anything radical, but you just put a bit of time and a bit of love into a place and the garden responds. So this is, around this time of year, hopefully in the next few weeks, we should see the sea kale starting to flower. And yeah, here we are. I think it's been a difficult few years, but I think hopefully the future of this garden is a long lasting and a bright one. So anyway, thanks very much. I think I've probably run over slightly, but thank you all for listening. And maybe there are some questions now. So back to you, Angela.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating exploration of a special place. I've always dreamed of going to it and never got to it, but I feel after this I have a very clear idea. If you'd like to stop sharing, Jonny, now we'll go into gallery mode. Hello, everybody. Yvonne, are there any, I saw Yvonne had shared a very useful piece of information about Jonny's article. So Jonny, Yvonne, I'll hand over to you. If you like to take us through the chat, if there was anything particular there. You're mute, you need to unmute.
Here I am. Yeah, well, I mean, just to say that, yes, I've circulated, for your information, I edit the website. So I've circulated everybody with the link to your article from January 2019, so they can see your travels in Tunisia. And it's worth a visit. I think we're all just completely taken aback by this wonderful exploration of a life, an artistic legacy, such a rich contribution, unbelievable amount that Derek Jarman achieved in those last years. It's just it's humbling, actually. And in the last couple of years, many of us in the society have been thinking about this question of, what happens to my garden if I'm not there anymore? And we've had this with the garden at Sperosa, the MGS, the lady who looked after it and developed it over many, many years. And our current head gardener, Lucy Willan, she too did fine arts at Cambridge. And I'm wondering if it's something we ought to be recommending to young people. This is a different dimension to artistic expression, artistic criticism and appreciation that we ought to be encouraging people into. I really do think it's, the question of whether gardening is an art or a science really comes out here in what you've just been taking us through. I think I must say to you, if anybody was not converted to this garden and what you were talking about, their heart would have melted when they saw your Atriplex halimus not surviving his first 3 weeks in the garden. Really, everything you've been talking about, albeit in southeast England, it speaks directly to what we are dealing with in our Mediterranean style gardens. I mean, I'm in central Italy, and everything you're describing as a challenge is something I'm having to deal with too. 1 or 2 little questions are coming in, and so I mustn't get diverted with my own enthusiasm here. Susan Brooks, who is also in central Italy, is asking, what is the relationship to the neighbours? Do they garden as well?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and actually one I probably should have given a bit more time to, because I think there's a real danger when you look at if you search Prospect Cottage online, for instance, you're mainly confronted with very beautiful but slightly misleading pictures of the garden, which show it almost in sort of splendid isolation on the shingle. And the way it's described, actually the way Derek himself describes it, is one that's slightly added to this narrative or this myth that he was this artist who moved to the edge of the world and started to create this sort of romantic idea of this sort of lonely artist. But actually, he was moving into a well-established community, and it is, yeah, it's tricky when you're standing in front of Prospect Cottage. You realize there's actually a row of houses, and there's neighbours quite close on either side. Fortunately, we're very lucky with our neighbours, because we have thousands of people coming to the garden every year, and there are no formal boundaries or cleared boundaries between properties. And often we get people being slightly inappropriate with the way they access the garden and walk through, or maybe we've had people even climbing the outdoor stairs of our neighbour's house to take photos of the cottage, and definitely crossing a boundary. But Dave Thomas, who's one of our neighbours, actually was one of the fishermen who fished with Keith for 8 years, and his brother Ken owned the boat, and they had such a deep love and respect for Keith that they were so happy to see Keith's wishes fulfilled, that this place now be used as an artist residency space. And I think there are a few other gardens on Dungeness where people are actively engaging with gardening. But we're lucky with our neighbours, and we do encourage, as I said, that Keith was welcomed into the bosom of this community, and through him I was able to meet a lot of the local people, and I really try to maintain those relationships. It's so fundamental to how we look after this place.
Fascinating. Gosh, such an unusual situation, isn't it? Okay, moving on. Rita Beale, I'm not sure where she's located, but she's thanks you for a fantastic talk. I think we all agree with that. Geoffrey Harding mentions that in southwest England, burning circles to control moorland growth actually has a name, and it's swaling. But he'd never seen it used domestically before. I mean, I suppose Dungeness is such an unusual landscape. It's the domestic.
It's definitely you need to control it, because actually it's said like there are no people have in it's a non-native, and it was introduced to Dungeness as a hedging plant, as a way to get round this kind of informal tenancy agreement where people were allowed to live there but weren't allowed to put up fences. But particularly our neighbour on the other side, her house has been almost engulfed in gorse, and I'm sure many of you know how flammable it is. You just basically you could throw a cigarette into it and the whole thing goes up. So it's definitely seen as a fire risk. It's actually incredibly good habitat for birds. It's hard to have that density of vegetation on Dungeness. So we're definitely not against it, but Derek planted it in these circles at the front of the garden, and to make sure that we maintain that structure, we have to cut them, and it's a very effective. The burning isn't totally necessary, but it is a very effective way of clearing out. When you cut away the main body of the plant, you're left with this stump that's covered in a rather unattractive sort of duff of all the dead leaves that have sort of accumulated over the years. So when you throw a bit of hot ash into there, it just goes up and it makes it really nice and clean. And then you do have this lovely effect where it blackens the stems, and then you have the green shoots coming out of the blackened stems. It's very satisfying. But we do it probably every 4 or 5 years.
Oh, interesting.
Just to keep the gorse nice and tight, stop spreading too much.
Now, Geoffrey Harding's also asking you, is it too cold on Dungeness for succulents in the outdoor area?
Definitely in the winter. We've had some pretty sorry experience with actually sempervivums not. He created what he sort of affectionately referred to as his sempervivery at the back, which is a sort of flat platform where he had lots of pots and old watering cans, and even an amazing verdigris shell, like a shell casing, that when a lot of the really interesting things in the garden and some of the relics that sort of in the house were after Derek died, when Keith was working on the boats as a fisherman, and they at that time they were using trawler nets. They would often bring up quite, interesting things from the seabed, including a lot of you know gun casements and shell casings, and one of those has been installed in the back of the garden and stuffed full of sempervivums. So they obviously can survive quite well outside. But the other succulents, we have a big, the photos I showed you, the pot collection is there from a couple of years ago. But those echeverias and things that we had in there have grown huge. And in the summer we tend to put them out into the garden, but certainly in the winter it's too cold, and they always they rot very quickly.
Okay. Now, Paul Davis, he's asking you, what is the nursery in Hastings that grows plants in sand?
That's Zophion plants. It's an unusual name, but it's Zophin, and it's it's a small nursery. Toby's just relocated, so he's just in the process of re-establishing, and he really only sells through. You may be able to buy plants from him online, but I think predominantly at the moment he sells at plant fairs. But that's where or you can go and visit the nursery itself. But I'm not sure if he has his online shop set up. But he grows a lot of interesting plants, a lot of Mediterranean plants.
Yes, I mean, because a lot of the plants that you've been showing in your talk are surprisingly unusual varieties. We're looking forward to a list, by the way.
Well, those. I mean, I worked at a plant nursery in the Netherlands, as Angela said, called the Hessenhof, which is really, that's a name that I think people should make a note of, because it's really one of the best. Well, so I'm totally biased, but I do think it genuinely is one of the best nurseries in Europe. It had the range of. I think most people think of Dutch nurseries as these large monocultures of tulips, and Dutch. It's true. I mean, there's certainly a lot of that, but the Hessenhof is a small family-run business with a plant collection of almost 7,000 varieties of herbaceous perennial.
Wow.
And because certified organic, which in itself was a great thing, but as a result, we weren't allowed to buy in plant material, or up to 2% of our annual production could be bought in. So that meant 98% of what we grew, we propagated ourselves. We grew 40% of, so about 3,000 plants were propagated every year, and about 40% of that was propagated from seed. And a lot of those seed-grown plants were, had their origins in botanical collections, and Hans Kramer and his wife Miranda do the nursery together, but Hans started the nursery when he was 18, so it's just celebrated its 44th year, and through that, over those decades, he's established really great relationships to different botanists and plant collections all over Europe, and I just think it's, why not embrace the full range and diversity of garden plants? It can only be of benefit, and so in a small way, that's what I'm trying to do. So the more unusual plants are, on the whole, things that I've introduced in the last few years. But I think it's just something we should all be looking for in our gardens, always looking for interesting new plants, not just sticking to the tried and tested.
Super. If Angela can circulate us with the name and link to that nursery, we'd be really, really grateful. Thank you. Okay, now moving on. Emma Bannister is asking you, what was Derek Jarman's opinion of nuclear power? I mean, apart from considering the buildings as the Emerald City.
Yes, exactly. I genuinely think it's fair to say that he was a proto-environmentalist. Not sure if you'd say he was a sort of full-blooded one, but he definitely didn't use chemicals when he was gardening, and he actually, he writes critically of the threat of the power station. And there's this line, I think he sort of self-identified as a white witch. He said the white witch out to get the nuclear power station. So this idea almost that he sort of was drawing. He was fascinated by, I had to flick through it a bit too quickly, but there's this Super 8 film called The Journey to Avebury. And of course, he referred to these stones as dragon's teeth, but they're obviously a very clear reference to, standing stones of Neolithic standing circles, stone circles. And the sense that those places held a kind of mystical power where the ancient past kind of erupts into the present was something that he explored a lot in his films. And I think somehow by creating these miniature circles, stone circles in his garden, he was channeling this kind of ancient magical energy which stood kind of in contrast to the kind of new technology of the nuclear power or something. I think there was like a deliberate sort of tension there.
Yes. Now, yes, an uneasy relationship with this brooding presence. It's so often in the background, any pictures we see, and gosh. Okay, look, I must keep going. Martin Kruger is asking how and where do you apply for the working weekends?
Okay, so working weekends is the easiest way to do that is through my Instagram, which is J Bruce Garden. And the way I tend to do it is that people send me a message through Instagram. I don't often reply immediately, but I will get to it. And I just put people who contact me. So that there's 2 weekends, one in March and one in October, and there's quite a long list of people who want to come and join. And I sort of do it on a first come first serve.
How many people do you have, Jonny?
8 to 10.
Okay, so quite small.
It's quite limited, but what I do is I send about a month before anyone who's contacted me, I then send out a sort of mass email, and it's whoever kind of gets back to me who can confirm their attendance, then gets to stay. And if it's not possible to join because there's too many people, then I just roll it over, and then those people get contacted first for the next weekend later in the year. But yeah, it's been such a special way of managing the garden. And actually this summer we're doing our first garden party. Because in the beginning I actually did 3 weekends a year, one in June, one in March, one in June, and one in October. But the June one, there's actually, there's less work to be done. It's more about enjoying the garden in this full moment of colour. And so we've decided to change it. So the June working weekend has now become a kind of garden party where we invite everyone who's helped over the years to come and just sort of have a drink and a barbecue, whatever.
Super. Thank you. Okay, now Christoph Vicious has jotted down quite a few of the names of plants that you've mentioned, ones which are quite unusual. Full marks to him. We hope we can compare his notes with your own, whether you can verify what he's picked up there, and we'll circulate that to everybody on the call, because we're all, as you know, we're all fascinated by plants that succeed and
Yeah.
different. Now Jodie Thomas, who lives near me here in Umbria, asking whether there are young people attracted to the garden and volunteer effort, because, well, we all want to engage younger folks in what we're trying to do.
Yeah, no, I think definitely. This has been, I suppose, one of the defining things about Prospect Cottage is its broad appeal. I mean, I love talking to different gardening clubs and organizations, but it tends to be an older sort of demographic, and it's really fun to have such a broad. I mean, we have older people coming on these weekends. It's certainly not exclusively young people, but it's but we do get a high proportion of, you know, people even in their 20s, and I think it's to do with Jarman as being such a broad artist and filmmaker, and he, particularly for the queer community, it's really hard not to overstate how brave he was, because he was actually the first public figure in the UK to come out as HIV positive. So he went on to television and the media and admitted that he had the virus, and this was at a time when people, you know, lots of people were dying, and they were saying, oh, it was pneumonia or whatever, and actually covering up the real cause. And Derek was you know, proud about his queer identity and wanted to be that figure for the gay community. And that there's a wonderful moment in his life where this group of radical transvestite nuns called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence actually canonized Derek on Dungeness as Saint Derek of Dungeness, really as a way to commemorate his standing in the queer community, and particularly around sort of gay rights activism. And that has, I think, allowed him to stay really relevant. And a lot of the young people who come are very inspired by that aspect of his work. But, you know, it's like what you said about Lucy Willan, that, you know, who's such a wonderful gardener, and what she's doing at Spirosa is so incredible. And, you know, people who are maybe coming from an arts background into the horticultural scene, I think that brings a certain creative angle, which often young people find maybe more accessible.
Yes, and a much more three-dimensional approach, not just a mania for plants, but also all of the other cultural aspects and the magic and everything you've just been talking about. Irresistible, really. Yeah. Okay, well, look, I think one or two people are having to go now, and they're all just thanking you so much for a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you. And I think we all agree. And Angela, back to you.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. And yes, I think that we will thank you collectively, and hope to see you one day on the Ness.
Yes, definitely. No, I tend to be there. You know, I'm not there every week, but I tend to be there about once a month. And yeah, if you see me in the garden, come say hello. I'm always happy to have a chat about the garden. And you know, there's no as I said, there's no barrier to get into the garden. The only thing that we ask if people come to visit is that we are now using the cottage, apart from on the days where it's open for public open days, and there's about 55 of those a year. But for the rest of the year, it's being used as an artist residency space. So when people walk in the garden, we just ask them not to sort of press their faces against the windows and try and look in, because there's probably someone in there. But to just, you know, to enjoy the garden and to walk around it, just keeping a respectable distance from the cottage.
Fantastic. We will do that. We can do that. Thank you, Jonny. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, take care, everybody. See you next month. Next month, I'll just say quickly, is going to be a talk, not a presentation, by the FT garden correspondent, Robin Lane Fox, and he's talking. I got into trouble of asking him for pictures and slides and things, so it's going to be hugely entertaining and extremely valuable, I'm sure. So I'm looking forward to that. It'll be slightly different to our normal output. Okay, thanks everybody. Take care.